welcome to Books and Books. I'm Mitchell Kaplan, and I want to thank you for coming out on this sort of chilly evening for those of us here in Miami. Not as bad as some of the other people suffering around the country. I want to let you know that we do a number of different events here at this store as well as a number of our other stores, and we'd like you to know about everything that's happening. If you go to our website, booksandbooks.com, you can sign up for our newsletter, and we send you more emails than you'll ever get in a single lifetime. And that happens daily. We just like to keep you informed about all the different things happening. In fact, this week alone, beyond tonight's wonderful event, we have George Saunders coming. Next week we have Ishmael Bey coming. We have Isabel Allende coming later in the month, in the early part of February. So we have a very, very full schedule, and we hope we find out about all the different things that are happening. I also want to welcome all the folks who are out there on the internet watching this live, and I want to personally thank the gentlemen in the black shirts from UA Media for helping make this happen. During the Q&A, I will come around with a mic so that people can hear it, through their computers as well. But tonight, it's a real honor to welcome Scott Berg to Books and Books. He's someone who's been here before, someone whose career we have followed almost from the beginning. I can say that before I was a bookseller, one of his books was probably the book that catapulted me into this entire world that has been my world for the last 32 years. Prior to being a bookseller, I thought maybe I'd get into publishing, and I went to this thing called the New York Publishing Seminar, which was part of NYU at the time. And the number one book that they had us read was this book, Max Perkins' Editor of Genius, which is a brilliant, brilliant book. And one of the really sort of eerie things that happened over that summer, which has to do with this book, and I told Scott that I would tell this story. There's a very seminal scene in the book in which Max Perkins is out picking up Thomas Wolfe at the docks after Wolfe had come back from Europe. And Perkins picked him up, and they spent a July 4th afternoon probably hitting every tavern in Lower Manhattan. And they ended up in Brooklyn Heights at the St. George Hotel. And if I'm not mistaken, they went up to the rooftop to watch the fireworks. And this was on a July 4th at the St. George Hotel. They were drinking, watching the fireworks. Now, in about 1980, there was a young kid named Mitch Kaplan on July 4th on the rooftop of the St. George Hotel where I was staying because there were condos at the time. And a friend of mine had given me his apartment, and I'm sitting up there on July 4th, the hottest July 4th in the history of New York, I think, and I'm reading this scene about the two of them being right where I am, and I had goosebumps. It was like this sort of incredible experience that I had with that book, right up there. So, I feel like maybe every July 4th I ought to go to the St. George Hotel and just read that scene. But Scott has continued his career from this book to just a remarkable career, including a biography of Sam Goldwyn and others. But we had asked this marvelous woman named Mim Harrison to do a more formal introduction. She does these great introductions, and Mim unfortunately has been taken with bursitis. So I told her that I would read her introduction, her loving introduction, because she's a huge fan of Scott's as well. Mim does all the books for Levenger. I think you know what Levenger might be. And so Mim wrote this. A. Scott Berg is a huge admirer of F. Scott Fitzgerald and made it a point to attend Fitzgerald's alma mater of Princeton. Fitzgerald is often credited with writing the great American novel with his Gatsby. Scott Berg might be called the one who writes the great American biography. His biography of Lindbergh won the Pulitzer, and his biography of Max Perkins the National Book Award. Both of these, and his biographies of Sam Goldwyn and Katharine Hepburn, have been New York Times bestsellers. With these books, and now Wilson, Scott has given us not just stories of fascinating people, but a biography of America in the 20th century. Scott is a Connecticut Yankee who has lived most of his life in L.A. He has that classic New England work ethic, spending years doing research, 8 years for Wilson, and then hours every day doing the writing. But he's also the kind of writer that Hollywood loves, even though he rarely drives. He has movie options on nearly all his books. In fact, Leonardo DiCaprio wants to play Wilson. As one screenwriter said, right, after The Wolf of Wall Street. And it's true, isn't it? As one screenwriter says, the scholarship is deep, but the drama of the life stories is what engages most. Scott always goes for the heart. It's what the Washington Post calls Scott's sensitivity and acuity. For the Boston Globe, it's simply breathtaking. Both the Post and the Globe are describing Scott's work in Wilson, and if ever there were a biographer meant to write Woodrow Wilson's story, it's Scott Berg. Scott has admired Wilson since he was in high school, even hanging up one of Wilson's campaign posters on his bedroom wall. By absolutely no coincidence, Scott attended the same college Wilson did. He wrote most of Wilson at his home in L.A. One of the reasons Scott says he likes to write there is because he can get into that zone where there are no distractions. He says it's easy to do in L.A. because no matter when he looks out the window, the weather is pretty much the same. That's kind of also true of South Florida. So maybe tonight we can convince Scott to write his next biography right here in Miami. Please welcome him, Scott Berg.
Well, thanks, and thanks, Mim, wherever you are. I hope you're out there in the ether sphere. Well, that was awfully. I don't know about you. I could have listened to that introduction all night. That was really nice, really nice. Well, we are going to talk about Woodrow Wilson tonight for a while. Before we get into that, just largely because of what Mitch and Mim had to say, I wanted to just pick up on a few of those threads, just so it's clear, well, to me and to all of you, how and why we all got here tonight. I think you're owed at least something of an explanation as to why one would spend 13 years writing about Woodrow Wilson. And I hope the weight of this book did not contribute to the bursitis in any way. But we wanted to produce a beautiful book, among other things, and I hope you will get really into it, because you'll see it's beautifully published with great paper and 111 photographs, and it's really a spectacular production job. But before we get into Wilson, I wanted just to say a few words about my other really most favorite subject, and that would be me. And I thought I would just explain a little about, you heard the titles I was doing, and rather correctly what I've been trying to do with my books, but I thought you might want to know where some of that impulse came from, which is when I was at Princeton, which I went to in large measure because of Fitzgerald and in large measure because of Woodrow Wilson. While I was there, I wrote my senior thesis on Max Perkins. When they passed my thesis back, they said, indeed, this is not really a thesis, it's really the first draft of a book. What Princeton English department failed to tell me is that it would take another 7 years to turn the thesis into a book. But it's a powerful impulse not to want to go to law school. And so that's why I wrote that book for the next 7 years. When I was 2 years into that book, I began to think, so I was 23 at that point, I began to think, wouldn't it be interesting to write not just a biography, but to write a shelf full of biographies. I was really having a good time, clearly, on that day, about 20th century American cultural figures. And I began to think of this apple pie I wanted to bake. And I wanted each slice, each figure I wrote about, to be from a different part of the country and to be a different wedge of the great pie that is American culture of the 20th century, a century in which I think this country truly emerged artistically in every other which way. So after Max Perkins, who was a ninth-generation white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, Harvard-educated man who went into publishing in New York City, I thought, what's an opposite of that? And I began to think of those first-generation Jewish immigrants. In one case, a man named Shmuel Gelbfish, who was a teenage runaway from Warsaw, who went to the West Coast, changed his name to Samuel Goldwyn, and invented something we now call Hollywood. After that, I began to think of a Midwestern figure. Who's the embodiment of aviation, I began to think about. I felt the airplane was a great icon of 20th century life, and specifically American life. And of course, all roads kept leading to Charles Lindbergh, who not only was the great embodiment of aviation, but was a very romantic figure, had not been written about properly, I felt, and had left great archives, which nobody had yet been able to get through. So, or get to even, I should say. And so after that, I began to think about the next wedge of the pie. Before that, there was a brief interruption when my publisher said, Scott, I know you never talk about this, but I know you have a friendship with Katharine Hepburn. And I said, yes, that's true on both counts. I have it, and I don't talk about it. And she said, well, why? And I said, well, because Miss Hepburn would like me to write about her, but she always said I couldn't write about her while she was still alive. And the publisher said, well, she said you couldn't publish anything while she was alive, but you could actually write the book and have it all ready to go so that when she does die, we could publish this thing. And I said, well, it's strange you mention that because on more than one occasion, she would talk about that very thing. And I said, or my publisher said, so Katharine Hepburn has actually discussed you are writing a book about her? And I said, yeah, the second night I met her. We were sitting there having dinner, and she said, you should really write a book about me. And I said, yes, okay, and that's because, and she said, well, it's because I'm fascinating, and she was. And anyway, after every visit I had with her, sometimes it was weeks at a time, sometimes it was just a quick dinner, but whatever it was, and she gave me the key to her house to live in, so sometimes I was there for months even, but after each visit, she would say, now go upstairs and write down everything I just said, because it was fascinating, And so that's what I did for 20 years, and then I began to pull all that together and wrote that book, Kate Remembered. So if you like Katharine Hepburn and want to spend some time with her, it's literally like sitting down and hearing her speak. But once that book was done, and it's hard to believe that was published 10 years ago now that she's been gone, but I went back to my apple pie. And that's what brings us here tonight, this guy, Woodrow Wilson. So I had written about an Easterner, a Westerner, a Midwesterner. I had not written about anybody from the South. And it doesn't occur to most people, but of course I knew, Woodrow Wilson was a Southerner. He was born in 1856 in Virginia, and he was raised in the Confederate States. He was raised in Georgia and the two Carolinas. So that interested me. I had never written about a political figure, a governmental figure. I had not written about anybody involved in higher education, as Woodrow Wilson certainly had been. And that is certainly a crucial component to modern American life, to 20th century American culture. And so it was at that point I went to my publisher and said, I've got a dozen ideas of people I might want to write about, but the truth is I have had in my hip pocket since I was 15 years old the name of Woodrow Wilson. And what do you think of that? And she said, Scott, I don't even want to talk about it. By the time you leave this office, the deal will be done. I will have your agent on the phone. I love Woodrow Wilson. She said, I don't really know that much about him, but what I know, she said, actually, what I know makes me want to know much more about him. And so we were off and running. And that's what brings us here tonight. So obviously I could go days, if not weeks, in talking about Woodrow Wilson, but I want to leave you with some take-homes, some things about Woodrow Wilson that you might want to take with you. And if you read the book, which I hope you will, you will see a couple of threads, two main threads as I was writing this book. They were things that had long occurred to me about Woodrow Wilson, but became reinforced, really enlarged and strengthened during the last 13 years, such that they really emerge as the great themes, I think, of this book, if not his life. The first is this. I believe Woodrow Wilson was the most influential figure of the 20th century. And I already see a lot of you thinking, oh, I know somebody, you know. Well, I hope during the course of the next few minutes, I hope during the course of the reading of the book, you will come to feel as I do. And I certainly have 800 pages that I think support this, that Wilson, more than anybody else, changed the century, certainly for this country, but I think for the rest of the world. The second thing, and in many ways this was more important to me, I believe Woodrow Wilson's personal life is the greatest drama, the most dramatic story that has ever unfolded in the White House. And I'm not forgetting the likes of the Lincolns and the Roosevelts and all the others who have passed through, but just for sheer drama, I think this Wilson personal story is unique and truly moving almost beyond words. And what I wanted to do was to try to knit this picture in which these threads would keep intertwining with one another. Because I don't think when you write a biography, you can separate the professional life and the personal life of your subjects. And I think it's extremely important to know that when you look at this picture of a man who is generally pictured as extremely dour, just this grave, serious minister's son, which he was. But I think you also have to bear in mind that I think this was the most passionate president we have ever had. And I wanted to capture that passion, all those emotions, of deep, deep romantic, and show how all that passion really influenced and informed every decision he made in his personal life and indeed in his life as President of the United States. So that was the charge for me, basically. That's what I was setting out to do. So here are some things to remember about Wilson, either as you walk out of here tonight or as you're reading the book. The first thing is this. Woodrow Wilson is the most religious president we ever had. And I'm not forgetting Jimmy Carter even. But this is a man who was the son of a Presbyterian minister, the grandson of a Presbyterian minister. If you shake the family trees of the Woodrows and the Wilsons, another dozen Presbyterian ministers will fall to the ground. They were just everywhere, Presbyterian ministers. He had that. And with that Presbyterianism, which I show you briefly in the first chapter, or the second chapter of the book, you will see Presbyterianism when it was founded was largely about this wedding of ideas that were not just religious, but also about education and about politics. That was a big part of the Scots Presbyterian tradition going back to the 16th century. So that was something that I wanted to capture as well. Wilson, well, I say he was the most religious. We have had a lot of religious presidents, certainly. Most of them get religious once every 4 years. Woodrow Wilson got religious 4 times a day. This is a man who got on his knees twice a day to pray. He said grace before every meal. He read the Bible every night. So religion, spirituality, morality influenced everything he ever said and did. Again, whether he was on the job or not on the job. Woodrow Wilson was the first Southerner to become president since the Civil War. Now, this is an extremely important and telling detail, which most books make almost nothing of. They talk about the fact that he really had no Southern accent, that most people, up to this evening, had no idea that he was a Southerner. And he was indeed kind of an every American, you know. I mean, he was from every place in the country in some ways. But I think it's important because Woodrow Wilson thought it was important. He talked about his Southernness for the rest of his life. The first memory Woodrow Wilson ever had, he was not yet 4 years old, but the first memory which he retained for the rest of his life was of being not quite 4 years old, living then in Augusta, Georgia, where his father was the minister of the local Presbyterian church, and going outside one early November day and hearing somebody shouting across the street, "Lincoln was just elected president. There's going to be a war." Now, almost all the other books about Woodrow Wilson make almost nothing of this incident. If they even mention it, they don't really talk about the influence of the Civil War on Woodrow Wilson. Again, I talk about it because Wilson talked about it. He never shook his Southernness. He never shook those memories of growing up during war-ravaged Georgia and then Reconstruction South Carolina. He remembered the devastation to the South. He remembered the deprivation just growing up in a household in which he saw his father's church turned into a hospital. He saw neighbors coming home maimed from the war, some neighbors who did not come home at all. He remembered the move to Columbia, South Carolina, which was still blackened from the war, some of the buildings, never to be reconstructed. He remembered kind of the nightmare of the politics of Reconstruction. So this is something extremely important. Woodrow Wilson is the only American president who ever grew up in a country that had lost a war. And that war was the Civil War. And he grew up in the Confederate States of America. And he remembered the psychology of growing up in a losing nation, one that thought the North had found its revenge in the end during Reconstruction on the South. So he remembered all those kind of psychological horrors of war. And again, remember our two threads here. This is really going to affect him 50 years later when he's President of the United States and must decide whether or not to bring his own country, the United States, into a world war. Very interesting. Everything's all connected. Woodrow Wilson was the most educated president we ever had. I stopped short of saying he was the most intellectual. I don't think anybody can forget Thomas Jefferson. But nobody received more formal education in the White House than Woodrow Wilson had. He went to Princeton as an undergraduate, where he was a very good student. He then got a law degree, already thinking that he would have a political career, and he thought having a law degree was a little like having a union card in Detroit. That's back when there was Detroit, but you know what I mean. And so he studied law, opened up a law office in Atlanta, Georgia, where Woodrow Wilson proved to be a truly terrible lawyer. Actually, that's a little unfair. I shouldn't say he was a terrible lawyer, because truth is he never had a chance to prove whether he was any good, because in a year and a half, he had no clients. None. That's an exaggeration, too, actually. He had one client. He didn't get the client. His mother got a client for him. And the client was his mother, who needed a little legal work done, and so she went to her boy. And anyway, he did this legal work, which has almost no importance whatsoever in terms of Woodrow Wilson's career, except for this job had to do with going to a little town outside of Atlanta called Rome, Georgia. And there, while he was doing this work, this Presbyterian minister's son, Woodrow Wilson, met the local Presbyterian minister's daughter and fell in love with her immediately, wanted to marry her immediately. I mean, he was truly smitten. The problem was he had no job. and he had no career. And obviously he needed something. And so it was at that moment he decided he really couldn't go into politics. He didn't have the money, the name. He needed to do something. And so he was going to go into academia. And so he took that moment then to decide to go on to graduate school. And he enrolled at Johns Hopkins, which was a fairly new school then with a fairly new and novel program of graduate education. And Woodrow Wilson became one of the first political scientists in this country getting his PhD at Hopkins. Now, why this is somewhat important is, among other things, Wilson had to wait, you see, 2 or 3 years before he could afford to get married. And so during this time, while he's studying at Hopkins in Baltimore, his wife is in Georgia and wants to have an art career. And so she's studying a little in New York, a little in Georgia. But the important thing is this. And you've got, and now this is a really jolly picture of Woodrow Wilson I have on the jacket. Most of you know Woodrow Wilson from the long-faced, glum, really severe minister's son. But for the next 3 years, Woodrow Wilson and this young woman from Georgia, Ellen Axon, exchanged thousands of the most passionate love letters I have ever read. Woodrow Wilson. These letters are unimaginably passionate. They are emotional, they are sexual, they are intellectual, they are so deeply personal. He wore everything on his sleeve, and she responded in kind. And they're just amazing, amazing letters. Anyway, they finally married. Wilson got a job teaching at Bryn Mawr College. He then moved to Wesleyan, and then he got a job at Princeton, his alma mater, where he came back to teach in 1890. Now, Wilson was hardly on campus before he had taken the place by storm. Classes that used to have 10 students suddenly had 200 because Woodrow Wilson was lecturing. He was the most dynamic lecturer on the Princeton campus. He became one of the most famous orators, first up and down the eastern seaboard, then across the country. He was giving lectures, well, for first, it was Princeton groups, but then other colleges wanted to come to talk. Then his lectures were getting more and more political, so various political groups were asking him to come speak. While he's doing all this with his left hand, with his right, he is becoming America's most famous historian. He wrote a dozen nonfiction books. Essays, he wrote a 5-volume history of the United States, books on the Constitution. He wrote a biography of George Washington. He's just everywhere. This man is a cottage industry. He's a force of nature, or at least a force of education. So much so that after being on the Princeton campus again for 12 years, the trustees of the school unanimously decided this man should be the 13th president of Princeton University, which he became in 1902, replacing a man whose name is forgotten and should be for the most part, but his name was Francis Landy Patton. And Patton, the 12th president of Princeton, is perhaps most famous for saying that he ran, and he was very proud of this, the finest country club in America. And basically that is what he did. It was a beautiful campus, and basically it was a school that catered to the sons of the very richest men in America. And that's all it was a country club. Wilson almost immediately set out to turn this around, and he did. He reformed not just higher education at Princeton, but higher education in this country. If you went to a college, or if you know someone who went to a college in which you majored in something, in which there's a sequence of courses within your major, in which you would take classes outside of your major to fulfill certain distribution requirements, if you had 2 lectures a week and then a small class, you studied under the Wilsonian model. These were all things Woodrow Wilson, as a college president, brought to higher education and created this model. And of course, to this day, virtually every college in the United States uses that particular model. Now, having tackled the pedagogy, basically the educational system at Princeton, he now wanted to take on the social structure. And indeed, this school was largely run by a system of eating clubs, rather like fraternities, which Wilson felt were not only unfair to students such as the one he had been, a poor minister's son, but that social life was overwhelming educational life, and he wanted to reduce that. And as he set out to change this system, the trustees suddenly said, "That's just about enough, Mr. Wilson. The school works just fine. We sort of like our little country club here, and maybe it's time to be moving on." And as he was contemplating his future, literally that month, he got a call from a man named Sugar Jim Smith. Now, I don't care what profession you're in. Beware of men named Sugar Jim. Sugar Jim Smith, that is, was the head of the Democratic Party in the state of New Jersey. Now, you're going to have to buy a premise here to get on with the story here. The premise is this, that in 1910, you've got to work with me. You've got to buy this one. In 1910, the state of New Jersey was the most corrupt state in the United States. All right? I know. New Jersey. But it was. It was corrupt in large measure because of a man named Sugar Jim, who was so corrupt he knew how corrupt he was, and he decided he's so corrupt that he needed to change the image of the party, of the machine that ran the party and the state, and his own image. And so he began to think what he really needed was a puppet. And he thought, who is a person in this state who has the most impeccable reputation, whom we can also manipulate? What about Professor Wilson at Princeton? Well, I mean, first of all, he's a professor, so we know we can push him around. That part was easy. But also, there's Wilson talking about getting rid of these clubs, talking about being anti-exclusivity, talking about, ideas that sounded rather progressive. So they went to Wilson and asked if he wanted to run for governor as the Democratic nominee, sort of assuring him he would win the election. And indeed, Wilson accepted. And he won the election in a landslide. And the first thing he did as governor of New Jersey, taking office in 1911, was get rid of the machine. He literally barred them from entering government buildings. And in a week or two, he had broken the most powerful political machine in the United States. And now, everybody in the country is looking toward New Jersey and seeing what this professor had done overnight. And now they saw what he did over the next year and a half, in which he introduced the most progressive agenda of any state in the country and got it passed. So he was an obvious choice to be a nominee for the 1912 election. And now occurs the most meteoric rise in all of American history. In October of 1910, Woodrow Wilson is the president of a small college in New Jersey. Okay? October 1910. November of 1912, he's elected president of the United States. This is crazy. It's crazy. But he did. And he ran in a really exciting election, the election of 1912, famously against William Howard Taft, the sitting Republican president, Theodore Roosevelt, who had didn't like what had happened to the Republican Party under Taft, so he bolted, formed the progressive wing of the party, the Bull Moose Party, and just to make things colorful, there was a fourth candidate, Eugene Debs, who ran as a socialist in 1912. So we have this wonderful four-way race, four really good, decent men, all of whom were great orators, none of whom anywhere near as good, really, as Woodrow Wilson, who, by the way, is the last president to have written all his own speeches. Every word he ever uttered was written by, usually in shorthand, which he could do better than any secretary, written by Wilson himself. So Wilson is now the 28th president of the United States. He got elected in an electoral landslide in 1912. Almost immediately, Woodrow Wilson, as he had done as governor, as he had done as president of Princeton, introduced the most progressive agenda the country had ever seen. And not only did he introduce it, he got it passed. And here's how he did it. Wilson, being a political scientist, well, I mean, he knew how government worked. He had never run one, but he knew how it worked, at least up here. He had a notion. Here's another premise you're going to have to buy. But you come along with me on this. Wilson believed, it's a crazy notion he had, but he believed that the executive branch of the government, that is the president, and the legislative branch of the government, the Congress, he had this notion that they should cooperate. That's all it was. Simple as that. But it was as simple as this. He meant that literally. He believed these two branches should cooperate the government. And so in order to get this incredibly progressive agenda passed, he literally believed it was his role as the president, to go down to Congress and work with them. You know, we have this tradition once a year in which the President of the United States goes to the Congress and delivers the State of the Union address. No president had done that since John Adams in 1800. Woodrow Wilson was the first president in 112 years to go down to the Capitol and actually do business with the Congress, to face them face to face, delivering State of the Union address. You know, if a president calls one joint session of Congress in his presidency, maybe two, that's considered a lot. Woodrow Wilson called 25 joint sessions of Congress. Every other month, he called Congress into session, sometimes in the summer, to discuss pieces of legislation he wanted passed, whether it was getting rid of the tariffs, whether it was the modern income tax, whether it was starting the Federal Reserve System, which is, of course, the basis of the American economy for the last 100 years, whether it was the Federal Trade Commission, whether it was putting the first Jew on the Supreme Court, Louis Brandeis, which basically was the first great glass ceiling to be shattered in the American government. Well, the list, you know, child labor laws, a 40-hour work week, all these things were Wilsonian things. And he did it not only by calling a joint session of Congress, but he did something even more amazing. He showed up the next day, and he'd show up the day after that, and the day after that. Sometimes Wilson would be on Capitol Hill 5 days a week, just muscling these guys, reasoning with them, sitting them down. Sometimes he would have like a little class, and he would just sit senators down and tell them how the government is supposed to work. And he did all this out of a little room that sits in the Capitol. Now, I gave a talk to a group rather like this about 2 months ago, and sitting there was the congressman from Woodrow Wilson's birthplace, Stanton, Virginia. And I began to talk about this room in the Capitol. And as I was looking at it, I said, "Congressman, do you know about this room?" He said, "I don't know what room you're talking about." And I said, "Well, you're not alone. Most people don't even know this room exists. And they don't know it exists because it has a very tricky name. It's called the President's Room. And it's a room that was designed for the president to go to Congress whenever he wanted and just sit there and conduct business. No president used this room before Woodrow Wilson. No president, with one or two exceptions every now and then, have used it since. Wilson was there, as I said, sometimes 5 times a week, and in so doing passed what he called the New Freedom, this very aggressive, progressive program. He was on a great roll. 2 cataclysms brought things to a halt. The first was, and not a grinding halt, because a lot of these things carried on for years, but after a year and a half in the White House, Wilson's beloved wife, Ellen, died rather suddenly. The President of the United States could barely get out of bed. He was so depressed, so distraught, I mean, literally, he took to his bed. The second thing is what got him out of bed, and that was the very week she died, World War I broke out in Europe. And now, the United States, the President of the United States, has to do something, even if it means doing nothing. But we have to have some role, whether we're in it or not in it. We have to be active about it. And that required the president. And what did this president do? He went back to his southern roots, and he remembered the Civil War, and for the next 3.5 years, he kept us out of war. And that indeed became his campaign slogan in 1916. By April of 1917, however, 1 month after his second inauguration, Wilson realized that the Germans were not backing down in their militarism. They were torpedoing neutral ships. American lives were being lost, most famously on the Lusitania, but there were a dozen ships that went down. There were hundreds of American lives being lost. The Germans were not responding to repeated diplomatic efforts on Wilson's part, and it finally reached a point where Wilson realized he had to bring his country into the war. And on April 2nd, 1917, Woodrow Wilson called a joint session of Congress, and he asked for a declaration of war. Within that speech, which he wrote himself, and indeed I've seen the shorthand draft of the speech, but within that speech, Woodrow Wilson uttered one sentence that has been the foundation of American foreign policy to this day. And the sentence, famously, is this: "The world must be made safe for democracy." Whether you like that sentence or not, whether you agree with it or not, it has been the foundation of every foreign incursion this country has staged, whether it is Mexico or Haiti, whether it is Vietnam, whether it is Afghanistan, Iraq, whether it might be Syria, whatever it might be. It all goes back to Woodrow Wilson's speech in 1917, which all goes back before that to basically the morality, the spirituality, the firm belief, almost a religious belief, this Presbyterian notion that Wilson had, that with great power comes great responsibility. And can we just sit by while dictatorial countries are just trampling over smaller nations? Do we not have some obligation? And basically, that has been the great American riddle, the great enigma, the great debate for 100 years. That debate was started by Woodrow Wilson. Goes on to this day. We got into the war. He proved to be an incredible commander-in-chief. He mobilized. We were an isolationist country with a very small army. Suddenly we became the mightiest industrial military complex on the earth. We won that war. In the end, I think the reason Wilson brought us into the war was he believed America could dictate the peace. because Wilson had a notion of what the peace treaty should look like. In fact, he had 14 ideas. He called them 14 points. And the 14th point was the most important. He was willing to sacrifice everything for the 14th point. He believed in something. He wanted to start an organization called a League of Nations. And he believed there should be, it's almost like King Arthur. It was a round table. He thought if there were a table, a room, where every country could convene and agree to talk things out before going to war, if that could occur, if everybody signed off, indeed, we might have just fought the war to end all wars. And Wilson was gone in Paris for 6 months negotiating that treaty. He got most of his 14 points, but he definitely got the League of Nations, came home, but of course he knew, as many Americans knew but did not realize, that a president can put whatever he wants into a treaty, but only the Senate has the power to ratify a treaty. And he came home to a hostile and Republican Senate. And if you can imagine, and I found this doing my research actually, I found some documents that nobody had seen, but there was a memo that Franklin Roosevelt, actually, who was the Undersecretary of the Navy, had written, in which he talked about secret meetings that Republican senators were holding while Wilson was away, in which they agreed to oppose any treaty Wilson came home with. Can you imagine Republicans saying they're against whatever the Democratic Have you ever heard of anything like this? And there it was, in Franklin Roosevelt's handwriting, there it was. So, Wilson, wanting this treaty desperately, realizing the Senate is not going to give it to him, embarks on what I consider, the greatest campaign for a cause, for a single cause by a single man in the history of this country. Woodrow Wilson set out on a 29-city tour of the United States to convince the people, to convince their senators, they had to ratify this treaty. And he was halfway across the country in the very hot summer of 1919 when he collapsed. And they rushed him home, and a few days later, he suffered a stroke. Now the story gets really good. Because the second Mrs. Wilson, did I tell you there was a second Mrs. Wilson? Well, there was. He met a very attractive young widow in Washington, a woman named Edith Bowling Galt, and he began to court her in the White House, rather privately. This is right after Ellen died. He wrote her hundreds of the most passionate love letters you have ever read. I mean, these letters, they're just over the moon. The other letters were like schoolboy letters. These letters are now the big thing, you see. And indeed, he talked her into marrying him, and there it is. But here's what happened, and it's one of the great ironies of U.S. history. Edith Bowling Galt Wilson and a handful of doctors made a decision. And I think it's the greatest conspiracy in American history. These 3 or 4 people decided nobody would ever be told that the President of the United States had a stroke. And for the next year and a half, nobody saw the President without first going through Mrs. Wilson. No document, nothing that needed a signature, nothing that needed to be read or discussed or considered, got to the president's bed without going through Mrs. Wilson. The book you will see really details this because it can be successfully argued that Edith Bowling Galt Wilson became the first female president of the United States. Because for a year and a half, this woman, virtually by herself, ran the executive branch of the United States government. So there it is. You can see how much she did do or how much she didn't do. But make no mistake about it, nobody was captaining this ship any more than Edith Wilson. And there it was. Wilson left the White House a year and a half later, the lamest duck ever to hobble out of the White House. He became the only president to this day to remain in Washington after his presidency. And in fact, if you're ever in Washington, you can visit the Wilson House, which is a museum now, and you half expect him to come down the stairs. I mean, it's just a wonderful, wonderful museum. And it was a rather tragic end for Wilson, who over the next 3 years faded away mentally, physically, emotionally, except for one rather interesting thing. He was succeeded by Warren G. Harding, who almost immediately proved himself to be, well, not only the most corrupt president we had ever had, but also the most immoral. So that's a nice combination. If you're going to be one, why not be the other? And suddenly there was a great hunger for Woodrow Wilson, for this man of great intellect, this man of great morality. And every afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson would take a drive around Washington, D.C. They would just go out for an hour, sometimes 2 hours, whatever. Every afternoon, there'd be 10 or 15 people out on the street, just across the street from the Wilson house on S Street, just hoping to get a glimpse of him. Gradually, there'd be 50 people or 100 people. On the anniversary of the armistice, November 11th, 1921, there were 1,000 people outside the Wilson house. The next year, 10,000 people. The next year, 20,000 people had gathered just to get a glimpse of Woodrow Wilson. He had become, you see, this icon of peace and freedom. Now, it's a lot more complicated, this story. I didn't get a chance to talk about the irony that this most progressive president was also, when it came to racial matters, the most regressive president we ever had. When it came to alien and sedition acts, he proved to be the most suppressive president we ever had during World War II. But make no mistake about this. Again, whether you like Wilson or not, whether you approve of Wilson or not, whether you agree with his measures or not, you cannot ignore him, because we live in a world to this day of Woodrow Wilson's making. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, thanks. Thank you. Oh, you're nice. Thanks. It's a great story, isn't it? Well, thanks. Well, listen, I'd be happy to take your questions. I have a man with a microphone, specially trained at this, a book lover even.
You have to speak loud because it's not for that.
Good evening. Incredible lecture.
Thank
I just
you.
want to ask you a question. You were interviewed in the last few months on the CBS Sunday morning show. And in my slumber that morning listening to you, you said something which I consider rather astonishing.
Okay.
You said that had Woodrow Wilson been alive, or had the League of Nations been in place, World War II would have been avoided. And I'm just curious as to how a league would have avoided Hitler, Mussolini, and Tojo. If you could please...
Yes, fair enough. Yes, and also it was in my slumber too. But that being said, I will stick by the statement. And in fact, I hoped I had said also, though, and I will get to the part you said also, that, first of all, Wilson believed that had the League of Nations been in place, World War I, and I will get to two in a second, World War I would not have occurred, because indeed that was a war that did not have to happen. That was a war that was largely about personalities, and it really became a war of egos. I mean, there were several months before they all went to war. Now, Wilson believed that had the League been in place right after the war, he felt that what problems were arising in the early 20s could have settled things down enough in enough places. And indeed, Germany wanted to be part of the League of Nations. And part of the problem, part of the rise of Germany in the 30s had to do with the fact that they felt they had been undeservedly punished or too severely punished, something Wilson had really fought the French and the British against while he was in Paris for those 6 months. But you see, it was important to Wilson that Germany be able to sit at the table. Which they could have done at a League of Nations. Same goes with Japan, in fact. And Wilson, and you'll see this is one of the interesting things in the book, when he has his stroke, he was having little strokes, I found, going through his doctor's papers in Paris. And one of the worst things he did in the treaty, I think, was he made some concessions between China and Japan. There were some mistakes here, no question about it. Most that really hurt China. But again, Wilson felt that had there been a league in place, things could have been equalized a bit. And Japan, too, you see, which was prepared to walk out of the conference in Paris, would have been included in the regular family of nations. And who else did you have? You had Tojo, you had, and Mussolini, yeah. Well, Italy, definitely. Italy felt, Wilson had the most trouble with Orlando during the peace conference, and definitely he felt Italy could have been assuaged had there been a League of Nations. Now, look, there are a lot of people who say no matter what a lot of people say the treaty is what led to World War II. That Germany was too severely punished, and that's where Hitler came from. I am the first to agree that Hitler was Hitler no matter what was going on in the world, and Hitler was going to rise. And there were plenty of Hitlers or Hitler adherents who felt no matter what the treaty said, it is Germany's time to rise again, and this time we will never be vanquished. And this is so similar. Wilson knew all this because Wilson grew up in the South after the Civil War. That's why he kept saying, don't punish these people. Don't be severe. Get what you need and get out. And that is something that he was not able to accomplish, but he thought the League could help accomplish that. Now, had that been the case, and I am now being as quixotic as Wilson, had that been the case, you see, maybe the German national spirit, the German national attitude, would have squashed an Adolf Hitler early on rather than embrace him. And in fact, because Hitler was putting out there what a lot of Germans felt, but I think would have been willing to surrender if someone was willing to include Germany in the great family of nations and help build Germany up. But nobody was. There was no league to protect Germany, in fact. And so they felt they had to rise again, and Hitler became a great spokesman for that cause. And I think you can translate that into Japanese and into Italian as well. Such was the case. There was such chaos. So the point I was making on the morning show was that because there was no league and because we never signed that treaty, the world was still a jump ball. And the Hitlers and the Tojos and the Mussolinis figured, okay, it's a jump ball. I'm swatting it for my team. And so they did. So that was my point. What else?
From whence do you come, Connecticut?
I come from Westport, Connecticut, which we love. Was born in the Norwalk Hospital, and then we moved out to California when I was 7.5 years old, just turning 8 actually, and when my father abruptly changed careers, he having had a little art gallery and selling art supplies in Westport, and overnight became a Hollywood writer and producer, and it was kind of a nice story. Which maybe I'll write about someday, because it was really kind of great. I mean, we weren't quite the Beverly Hillbillies or the Jodes, but we basically, all went west, and suddenly we're living in a house with a swimming pool. It was very dramatic for a 7.5-year-old, I must tell you. Very dramatic, yeah. Yeah, well, that ain't go. Thank you. I'll take it.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I don't know. Is this working? Okay.
I just wanted to mention, and maybe you've come across it in your research or in some of the documents, living half the year as I do in the Czech Republic and
Yes.
in Prague, of course, Woodrow Wilson is mythologized.
He is God.
He is just, yeah, absolutely. And they have, I don't know, were you in Washington when they unveiled the Woodrow Wilson statue at the Czech embassy?
I was not there
last
for
year?
that, but I have done things with and for the Czech embassy because whenever I come to Washington, it's, oh, can you come and talk about Woodrow? I mean, to this day, you know, he is basically the man who put them on the map. And so Wilson to this day is revered by the Czechs. And, you know, you have to remember, when World War I came to an end, 4 great empires had toppled within a few years. The Hohenzollerns, the Habsburgs, the Ottoman Empire, and the Romanov Empire. More than half the world, just the territory, was all up for grabs now. And here are these 3 or 4 men, namely Wilson, Clemenceau, Lloyd George, and Orlando for a while before he stormed out because Wilson wouldn't give him everything he wanted. And he said, come to the League of Nations and we'll sort it all out. But in that moment, you see, all this world was up for grabs. And it was largely Wilson who determined, well, who would be self-determined? and he recognized the Czechs and said, you know, you should have your country here. Absolutely, he was a friend of Masaryk, and he protected Masaryk, and this was largely what Wilsonianism was about, and this is what he thought his 14 points would do: would protect nations like what became Czechoslovakia, among others, many others.
Anyone else?
I just wanted to know whether you have completed your American Pie, and if you have not, can you share with us who you might be writing about?
Well, this is a really good question, which I'm trying to deal with right now, is whether I've completed the pie or not. On one hand, I say to myself, okay, I've been baking this thing for 40 plus years now, and I could argue that I've done the north, south, the east, and the west. You know, if I say Lindbergh was from the north, not just the Midwest. And maybe I should just sort of move on, maybe write some haiku. Just, you know, a few syllables. Maybe write that novel that I never wanted to write. Or I put to you, if you have any ideas, the gate is open. So I'm actively looking for a great, wonderful idea. No, I don't have one. I will tell you that during the course of usually 10, on this book, 13 years that it takes me to compile it, every now and then I come up with an idea. I write it on a piece of paper and I throw it in a drawer. And I have not opened the drawer yet. I can remember 2 things that are in the drawer. I don't remember if there's more than 2 or how many there are. I just don't know. But we'll see. I'll open it soon and see what's in there. And I hope there's something wonderful. But if not, I'm really counting on you all tonight to give me a future.
2 realms you can address are music or sports.
Well, you're thinking correctly. Yes, exactly right. And within those, and here's the thing. Here's the key. Well, to use a cinematic metaphor, whose life can I use as a lens to take a panorama shot of the nation in a century and even the world, maybe even the human condition, you know? So Max Perkins, you see, let me tell the story of 40 years of American literature, and Samuel Goldwyn let me tell 50 or 60 years of Hollywood history and so forth. Whose life will allow me, whose life in sports, for example, can tell a larger picture, even beyond sports. You know, what does it tell about America in the century? So, well, that's a very good, I mean, he's a perfect subject. And then there's one other thing. Now, the next question: has he been written about well? And I think he's been written about pretty well in a couple of books. So the question we all ask is, that is, we biographers, do I have anything new to bring to this party? In the case of Woodrow Wilson, even with the thousands of books on Wilson, I did feel I had something new to bring, which was to tell this personal story of Wilson that I felt had been left out of all the books. The man of passion, the man of romance, that stuff hadn't really been dealt with. And then, of course, I had access to family papers that were recently discovered that nobody has seen but me, and his doctor's papers. So I had all that could help explain a lot. And indeed, having been reading about Wilson all my life, I had a picture in my head of Wilson that I hadn't seen in any other book. So if I could come up with that for a Muhammad Ali or somebody of his weight, that'd be a great subject. Yeah, you got another one.
One sec, let me get you
sorry.
the mic.
Thanks for coming here tonight. I find it interesting that this, you say, is most academic, most intellectual president. It sounds like it, obviously, so progressive, these tremendous ideas. Yet he was a segregationist, huh?
Yes.
We didn't quite get into that irony, but it's just so.
We can do
it's so off to me when I learned about it. And did he think the South was right? He goes back to you go back to the Civil War with him. Did he think the South was right to secede?
He did
and was there bitterness over that?
There was.
That they lost.
All of the above. And this is an increasingly complicated subject, which I'm always happy to talk about. But I have to preface this by saying a few things. First of all, I am not Woodrow Wilson. I'm not a segregationist. So what I'm about to say is about Wilson, not about me. The second thing is this, and this is something biographers have to fight all the time, and it's something we call presentism. I have to take you out of the year 2013 and put you back in the year 1913, when it was a very, very different world. It simply was. Now, let me start with the bad news. Woodrow Wilson did segregate the federal offices. He segregated the Treasury Department and the Postal Service. In so doing, he essentially sanctioned any government at any level anywhere in the country to impose segregation. That he did. Now, behind that were the following. It was basically his Postmaster General and his Secretary of the Treasury who initiated those things, who said they had to do it. Wilson went along with his cabinet members. Wilson had a very Southern and very segregationist, a really racist cabinet. Now, Woodrow Wilson appointed all of them, but it bespeaks something that I think makes the point I was trying to make, or would like to make, which is race for most of the country was not a big issue in 1912. When Wilson appointed Southern racists to his cabinet, this was nothing unusual at all. There were Ku Klux Klansmen proudly sitting in the United States Senate, sitting on the Supreme Court. This was not an issue. I mean, this was perfectly acceptable behavior.
It's not far removed from Plessy versus Ferguson.
1896, I mean, it was fresh. I mean, that was the law of the land, was separate but equal. And basically, that is what Wilson was embracing for this reason. Being from the South, he was not a virulent racist. He was not somebody who put the black man down. He didn't think they should be kept out of American society. What he did think was, in 1913 when he became president, he did think, because he was a Southerner and he knew the South so well, the country, especially the South, was not ready to embrace integration. And he just felt in his bones that integration was going to lead to the kind of revolution the country had never seen and would never see. And he just didn't think the country could take it. He often said it will take another 2 generations before the United States is ready for that. And I think if you pull out your calendar, you can almost check off, the 50s and 60s when we had it. And I think he realized, in 1913, there were still people who had fought in the Civil War. There were still a lot of Southerners refighting the Civil War. And they knew slavery wasn't going to come back, but by God, we can still keep the black man in his place. Wilson really didn't want to do that. He didn't want to keep the black man in his place, but he felt by having separate but equal, if we could have the black man on a parallel track with the white man for a few more decades. Sorry? Yes, yes. Now, yes, quite loosely. But and here's the rub. And here are the two things I think Wilson is genuinely guilty of. I don't think they are acts of commission, but of omission. The first is what you just said, that in fact they weren't parallel tracks, and it was pointed out to Wilson that the lavatories, the lunchrooms in the Treasury Department for the black people were different than they were for the white people. And Wilson said he was going to do something about it and basically never did. Here, however, I think, is Wilson's greatest act of omission. And it occurred in the spring of 1919 when the soldiers were all coming back from World War I. Tens of thousands of African Americans fought in World War I. And they presumed this would be the great moment for the black man in America, that they would come home and they would be embraced by American society, that they had shed blood, they had lost brothers just the way the white man had, and that this would be the time that they would be integrated into American society. And it would have been a great teaching moment for America's professor-in-chief to address especially his Southern brethren and say, you know what? This is now the moment where we really must make some changes and start including the African American. And Wilson said and did nothing. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the following summer, 1919, is the famous Red Summer, the summer of these bloody riots, race riots across the country. And I think it was that moment that African Americans realized they were not going to get ahead as a result of the war. And I think that also, in some ways, further makes the point I was trying to make before. You know, Wilson had one thing on his mind when he got back from Paris. That was the League of Nations. Race. People didn't want to think about race. They didn't want to talk about race. Lynchings were going on. Wilson did try to stop lynchings. He was the first president to say these should be illegal. We shouldn't have lynchings in this country. If you can imagine, it took a president to have to say that. But it did, and it was Wilson. But he so clearly did not do what he could have done. And I will add one more point on this, and it's somewhat cynical, but I think it's exactly the case. Wilson came into office with this very progressive agenda he wanted to advance. Within weeks, the Southern senators came to him, because there had been some motions of integration already happening in the country. And they said, if you have any intention of going forward with this, if you're going to continue to appoint black men to even mid-level jobs in the Treasury Department, black judges, you are going to get nothing. And I think Wilson weighed that. He's continued to make some black appointments, some traditional ones, but basically that was it. He didn't press the South because he wanted his agenda passed. And I think that's at the fount of it.
I can't just tell you how much that all of us appreciate you
Oh,
here
good.
tonight.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks for being here. Thank you.
You know, I have to say that somebody prior to coming in, one of our guests said, you know, he saw him in Cleveland or somewhere, and
St.
it was
Louis.
St. Louis, and was the greatest speaker that he has seen. And I have to say that in all the history of Books and Books, this is one of the great evenings we've
Oh,
had.
good.
So I thank you very,
Thank
very
you,
much
thank
for
you.
it.
Thanks for being here.
And now it's your job to go ahead and buy 10 books and make sure that Scott feels right at home signing them. So all the books are available up front. We also have his backlist books too. So if you've missed one of those, you can pick one of those up as well. Again, thank you all for coming.